Welcome to a recorded video of Nature Glenelg Trust's Wetland Restoration Workshop, which was held on the 4th of May 2022 with participants across Tasmania. This session was supported by NRM South with funding through the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. We picked the seminar up a couple of minutes into the start. We hope you enjoy it, and for more information please visit our website www.ngt.org.au. So we are busy, and we've been busy over this time. Really a key goal for us is looking for ways to turn restoration science into practice, and we like to work alongside community in its various forms, but we come as an active and informed participant, and we like to then use those skills and our background as science trained people to work seamlessly and get the best really out of the perspectives that the different types of people that have an interest in environmental management can bring. And the danger with these silos that often exist, not just within organizations but between them, is that people that fall into these categories at times aren't necessarily talking to each other, or their insights, their perspectives, the outcomes of what they're doing aren't necessarily informing each other in a timely fashion. So this is a gap that we, as well as the on-ground gap, there's also a communications gap that we're pretty keen to fill, and we like to do so in the way we go about the work. And I'm hoping those of you that have been seeing our updates on this project will see what I'm talking about here when I refer to this, that communications is a really important element of successful project delivery from our point of view. Just in terms of wetlands specifically, even though that's not all we do, it has been a big focus. Over the last decade, we've restored more than 50 wetlands across all land tenures, and also some NGT owned demonstration sites, which we have purchased to where we've had a land management challenge that couldn't be resolved any other way, and where an area would make a great restoration demonstration site. We have also become a landowner, which is, I guess, another interesting element to our model that others, we're not just strictly a landowner or a service provider, we're a bit of a combination of all of the above. In terms of sites on public land and other protected areas, I thought I'd just give you a sense of how widespread the issues are of hydrological issues affecting wetland reserves. And there's a long list. This isn't all of them, but it just gives you a sense of and I won't read them out, but across Victoria, SA, Tassie and New South Wales, this is just a selection of some of the sites that are protected in some sense or another, but that carry this legacy of modification prior to reservation, which means there's which means there's legacy issues to deal with using remedial methods, which is, I guess, a focus for what we're talking about today. So I thought, in terms of giving you a sense of, well, how do we go about this process? And hopefully this will get your brains ticking over for sites that you're familiar with. I thought I'd just step you through our approach to how we go about looking at investigating a site from an eco-hydrological perspective. And it is a little bit different to a traditional scientific study, because what we are deliberately trying to do is blend information sources and blend different types of expertise to give us the deepest insight possible into a site. So firstly, getting to know the site. And when I say get to know the site, I mean from all angles and perspectives, both modern and historical. And then there's obviously modern tools that we can use as well. And these really help us understand a site. So the first example I'll give you is a reserve down on the coast south of Mount Gambier in South Australia, a place called Hutt Bay. There are a range of fantastic tools for piecing together the pre-modern scientific era, pre-aerial photography era type history of a site, and early survey diagrams. And you'll see there, if you have a closer look, the annotations on this, observations about vegetation, the areas that were being inundated, the distinction between where dunes finish and wetlands start, and the different vegetation types begin and end. There's a whole lot that you can gain from these old survey diagrams, which is fantastic. And the same goes for old newspaper articles, old journals. There's a whole range of different sources, old photographs that may have been taken in front of a feature. There's a range of ways to really glean deeper insights than are possible than just looking through the published literature. And obviously then aerial photography does kick in at a certain point, and that tells us a lot about site history. In some cases, we're lucky enough to see a site prior to modification. In the case of this wetland, so far, the earliest photo we've got, the site was already modified and had artificial drainage impacts, but I'm waiting on hopefully a 40s image of the site, which maybe will step us back far enough. And then obviously you can detect change over time from the aerial photography. There's all sorts of modern information we get from mapping layers that are really helpful. Drainage layers, distribution of species, uh, vegetation types, etc., etc. The list goes on when we get to more modern era, but those information sources need to be read in context. And I guess that's really the whole point of this discussion today, is understanding how to interpret the landscape and put those things into context. Then obviously a really fantastic modern tool is building a digital elevation model, a profile of the land surface based on LiDAR data. And so this is really helpful for understanding drainage impact, but also the flip side to that is restoration potential. And you can see there the elevation above sea level, which gives us a sense of the picture of this wetland and its shape and its potential to hold water. So another really important aspect of what we do is getting to know the people, the relevant people around a project, the landowners, people who have spent time at a site. Um, there are so many aspects to this that it's really difficult to summarize, but because every site is different, and reserved land brings different challenges to private land, the sort of investment that people have in these sites. Understanding this socio-political landscape, though, if you're serious about getting things done on the ground, is absolutely critical, because this is where the barriers usually will come from. It's not because we've got some scientific or technical issue we can't resolve. It's usually because we haven't navigated the people issues. So, our approach to this is to really bring people on a journey. And for those of you that have been getting the updates to this project, I'm hoping you're feeling and seeing that from the way we share information as we go. And for those of you that don't, if you'd like to get those updates, we can certainly share them with you now that we've got your email addresses if you're interested in that. An example here is a place called Glen Shira Swamp, which straddles a conservation park south of Adelaide in the Fleurieu Peninsula. And there's just a photo there of some of the people that we met on site when we started the project. And, instead of going away and doing a whole lot of work, we got out there with some of the most interested people who know the site well and picked their brains, shared our initial observations about the site, and began that process of explaining how to bring these things together. And it really did help resolve some of the initial concerns and tensions that people had, because what you'll find when you're working on these restoration projects is there is a knee-jerk reaction, particularly among conservation-minded people are generally conservative, because we've spent our professional lives often firstly learning about and then thinking about how to protect things that could be compromised. So I understand where that conservatism comes from, but it often bleeds over and affects the way people see the possibilities for restoration, which we just have to be prepared for and ready to talk through. And it's amazing how spending time on site with people and looking at the modifications and thinking about where the values now are, and we've got some flora experts there in the photo, all of a sudden some of those potential barriers really start to evaporate when people are seeing their piece of the puzzle in that wider context. So within the park, that was really important. And, what we realised pretty quickly at this site was the feature itself straddled a significant area that had been drained and developed. In the left of those images, you'll see the park boundary outlined in yellow. There was a significant part of this swamp was actually on the private land next door. And even though we were initially asked to look at the park, we managed to twist their arm to expand the assessment and include the neighbour's property, because wetlands that straddle boundaries, you don't really want to be looking at them in isolation. So in terms of the next step or another step in this process, the importance of reading and interpreting the landscape. And this is where taking the information that you glean from the sources that you can assess remotely and dovetailing that information with what you observe on site is really so important, because There are clues in the landscape. Obviously, some are really obvious, like the location of drains. Other things are more subtle, and you've got to really tune your eye in to see them. But then when you put them into context, it can be quite fascinating. So this example here at Walker Swamp, this is another NGT reserve in the Southern Grampians in Western Victoria. And Greg Kerr, who worked on the restoration plan for this site for us, he went through an interesting exercise of trying to work out what the former, what we call sill level or inundation depth was for the different wetlands on the property. And what we came to discover was that the central lunette that runs up through the spine of the property appeared to have always been a hydrological barrier on the property. So rather than assuming that all the wetlands on the property inundated originally to the same depth, what we discovered when we overlaid the location of the river red gums on the property, and particularly the oldest ones, and you'll see the red gums there marked in red, what Greg was able to ascertain by combining that biological distribution information with the LiDAR imagery was to see that the western wetlands on the property appeared to be linked to the flooding regime of the adjacent river system, the Wannon River. And you can see there the contour that's been marked to 43 metres above sea level corresponds with a band where roughly the red gums are growing at that height or above, which sort of gives us a clue as to the likely hydrological regime on that side of the property. On the other side of the property, and this was confirmed by the physical information about the point of where flows would have spilled over historically. But the big old red gums were telling us that actually the wetlands on the eastern side of the property were actually a step up in the landscape and could inundate to a deeper depth. Which was really interesting because the assumption we'd made initially was that these were all floodplain wetlands of the Wannon. But as it turns out, prior to drainage, seepage from an adjacent wetland system, a major wetland system to the east that's subsequently been drained, must have been feeding a groundwater component into this chain of wetlands on the eastern side of the property. The reason this is relevant is because there's a drain now that comes into that side of the property and we could manage levels independently along that zone. So, really important information can be gleaned even if a site's been highly modified, and this site had been. It had been planted to blue gums and the red gums were barely visible initially. But those long-lived species can tell us a lot about hydrology if you know where to look. And they're not all trees. At this site, we've also got some really old Garnia tussocks, for instance, and they're a perennial, persistent, long-lived species. The young ones aren't so helpful because they will move with hydrology, but the oldest individuals can be really helpful for piecing this information together. So that's the long-lived species. The short-lived species, and this is the bad news, and this is the thing that often gets people distracted when we're thinking about hydrological change, is that the short-lived species, and there's lots of them in wetlands because our wetland flora is highly responsive to changing conditions. That's what floodplains and wetlands often do if there are ephemeral or seasonal systems, is that the regime in the wetland, the water regime is different every year. Now that means that plants do have the capacity to move up and down slope. But these plants aren't so helpful because they're not really telling us about historic state. If we can monitor them over time, they can certainly tell us about change. And that image there shows you a little bit about the process of terrestrialization, which we see occurring across the landscape. And this is the process that in the reserve sites that we were referring to earlier that had modified drainage. This is the process that often confuses and confounds the situation because people will have studied a site in its modern state and the native plants will move down slope in response to the change and for all intents and purposes look natural. The dilemma is if we've got an underlying hydrological challenge that we haven't addressed, those plants are representative of the modified regime and where they're growing is not the original regime. And the question for us that we have to answer is, do we want to tip the balance back in the favour of aquatic and semi-aquatic conditions and create additional zonation in wetlands, or leave it in a terrestrialised state? Now, usually we end up where people go, you know what, we've lost so many wetlands from the landscape. We need to push this back in the other direction. And through hydrological restoration, the fantastic thing about this is we can. This is possible. Other thing just to mention is that microtopography in wetlands really matters. And by that, I mean really small changes in elevation really matter. So this is a wetland northeast of, or north of Melbourne near Benalla, Rowan Swamp, where we're about to initiate a restoration trial. And you can see how winding the water levels up, I think these are 10 centimetre increments, just how much difference it makes to how much of the site inundates. Now that impacts not only how much area, but also how long the water lasts, how deep it is in the deepest areas. Now that affects species distribution. This is really important. This applies across the board at drained wetlands, these shifts, and it really illustrates what we were talking about earlier about how we can work with plants that move up and down slope. The other thing to think about, and this is important for all wetlands, but particularly important for salt marsh and for wetlands where you don't have a strong driving head of flows. There's not. Salt marsh is a great example. Think of areas where it only takes a minor barrier in a salt marsh area where a surging tide previously could just spill through at natural surface and reach an area of higher salt marsh ground in high tides, or occasionally if you put any barrier to that, just putting a couple of culverts in won't overcome the challenges of equalizing flows through an area, because the flows are diffuse and they're having to flow through all the lumps and bumps of a very flat landscape, and there's not the time for levels to equalize. That's a very different situation to when you're driving water through a culvert down a slope where all the water has to end up going through that hole because it's coming down a creek or a river system. So this is one of the reasons why our coastal environments are so sensitive to changes in that microtopography, because it really does have a flow-on effect to how flows are distributed and how they move through the landscape. So yeah, I guess, and speaking of salt marsh and barriers to flow, this area is a big marsh is just south of Melbourne near the Werribee treatment plant, actually on the boundary of it. Straddles multiple tenures, but this was a site where really it became apparent to us just how many different things were going on, and the importance of placing the history of change into a timeline so that people can really understand why and how these factors are confounding and very difficult at times to disentangle. So to give you an example out of the report that we prepared for this project, which we're hoping will progress to some additional works. We've done a little bit of work here modifying the way flows move under the road that was interrupting flows. But when we started this work, the assumption was that was the major issue. By the end of it, we realised there were all these other issues that were going on at this site, and we really needed to try and disentangle when and how they began to have an influence. And as you'll see there, without going into all the details, there's 6 different issues, and when they began, uh, and the influence they're having changes through time as well. So this stuff is complicated. At some sites, it's more complicated at others. But once you piece this together, you can work out which elements we can actually do something about. Some of them we can't, and we can prepare, but we might be able to prepare for. Case of sea level rise. Others we can actually change. So this is a really helpful exercise to go through when determining a course of action. So back to the Glen Shearer swamp example, it can be really useful to go out and observe a site under current, flowing conditions to see, well, what effect are these, the network of drains having? Placing this modern information into the historical context and understanding, well, where were the drains? And if you look back at when the drains were constructed and their purpose, it happened gradually over time. So quite often, an initial drain may have been dug, if you look at those top 2 images, to bypass flows around the swamp. We go out there today and some of that drain doesn't flow anymore because it's been superseded by later drainage that was put in and through the bed of the swamp itself. So even the drains themselves are not uniform in their impact in space and time. And, as you probably gathered from what we've been talking about so far, this really is a bit of a detective exercise to piece this information together and come to the closest version of the truth that we possibly can to then determine where to next. And obviously that then allows us to work out if we, what can we do about this? Are there remedial works we could apply that will help address some or in some cases all of these legacy impacts? So To go back to that first example at Hutt Bay, this NGT reserve, we've literally just completed a phase of major remedial works down there, backfilling all the internal drains. But to show you the importance of navigating that socio-political landscape, you'll notice that so that the parcel to the left of that image is not part of our reserve. It's owned by a neighbouring landowner. We get along well with them. One of the reasons we get along well with them is because we're not forcing anything on them. And at the moment, we have an agreed level that shows you that is illustrated in this image, but they aren't comfortable yet to go to a higher level of inundation, which will spread further across their part of the wetland. Now, to achieve more of our objectives on our side of the fence, we've been able to design a solution that allows us to lift an existing crossing in the wetland. You'll see that black line, which is we've formalised into a levee bank, and we've put a second spillway in, which allows us to control and achieve a much closer to full restoration scenario up the eastern end of this wetland. So, you know, this ability to compromise and work out how to work across boundaries and work with people, and over time this may change and we may be able to adjust levels up. We've designed this in such a way that we can. It just shows the importance of problem solving, you know, and really thinking about how the feature interacts with the reality of the situation on the ground and who your neighbours are. In terms of you know, articulating and implementing the restoration plan, once you've been through those steps, you know, hopefully this is a formality because you've already been talking to people about what you've been finding and what it is we're thinking of doing, and there's a familiarity with the potential actions by this stage. Our goal through the restoration plan implementation phase is really to simply initiate a positive trajectory of change. And I use that term deliberately, a trajectory of change, rather than trying to predefine an end state, because this is ecology, this is a moving beast, the environment is, and you are setting yourself up to fail if you think you can pick a defined, precise end state. Wetlands in particular are highly variable ecosystems that are changing through time anyway. So what we're really about is making sure that the building blocks are in place to allow the system to adjust to the new regime. And is it heading in the direction that we want it to head in? You know, is the trajectory of change positive? Is it, you know, it's the direction rather than the destination that we're focusing on typically with these projects. So obviously then once you've put that thinking in, you can carefully plan and undertake remedial works where you can undo some of the past damage. Now, that image there is in the conservation park at Glen Shearer Swamp. As you can see, when you backfill a drain, you allow for flows to go back in the direction that they should be going, rather than the way that the bypass drain was taking them. And even though this image looks better quality in terms of the existing vegetation, there was a drain through this area of the peatland. And this is on the neighbouring property just next door. And you'll see this only 2 years later, because of the recontacting of the water table with the surface, resaturating the peat, and the fact that there was a viable seed bank there and lots of vegetation around it, there's been a really fast response. So this area will be unrecognisable very quickly after the restoration and remedial works, really. It's a way of you know, understanding that when a past modification has resulted in physical disturbance, then further physical disturbance is required to remedy that situation. And, you know, once you get your head around that and you understand that wetlands respond quickly, it's not quite as daunting a prospect as many people might imagine. I will mention, though, that given the hesitation that people will often have about wetland restoration, particularly in reserved lands, and this isn't always relevant depending on the characteristics of the site, but in many cases where there's been a physical wetland basin and it's been breached in one location, before going in and backfilling drains, undertaking trials is a really useful method of, it's impermanent, it can be reversed, it's cheap, and you can get people involved, which is very therapeutic for them if they've wanted to see an area fixed for a long time. And it allows you to try before you buy effectively. So it's been an extremely valuable tool in many situations for us over the years. And as you can see, plenty of smiling volunteers there. In terms of monitoring, and this is really important, but one of the challenges we have is that projects are often built around the works phase, and there isn't often the trailing resources to invest in monitoring. So, and I know this is a challenge for anyone listening who's involved in project delivery in environmental programs, because they tend to have a finite life, and then there are all these really interesting things we could and should be learning that are very difficult to track. So we, aside from a few sites where we're able to invest in longer term monitoring, often we have to use very carefully selected measures and sometimes surrogate measures for wider impacts because they're quicker and easier to collect. So this is an example of another NGT reserve, this time in South Australia. Before and after restoration works. So, you can monitor water levels. You can monitor this site through aerial photography. You can also see a vegetation response there. We have some keystone species out there. The ecological values do follow every time you alter a hydrological regime. Just as you dry a site out, the ecological values shift. When you re-wet a site, the ecological values bounce back, particularly in this case, because there's a really important wetland reserve next door. So we had an explosion in this nationally vulnerable species, the southern bellfrog or growling grass frog, depending on what you like to call it, which in the very first year after restoration had a mass breeding event in the wetland, which was fantastic, not to mention a host of other threatened species, including fish and birds that have now been detected at the site. And a site down on the coast in Western Victoria at Long Swamp, just to show you how environmental values in terms of flora will shift. And this is also a water monitoring location and a photo point for us, this location. So this wetland was drying out. The terrestrialisation process was occurring. You'll see the shrub invasion there. And as water levels rose, you'll see the shrubs going, oh, it's getting a little bit wet for me here. And only a couple of years later, we have wholesale shifts in vegetation. Now, this is where the interpretation and the understanding about the goal, which is that trajectory of change, is really important. So you could, take someone out there and say, oh, this is terrible. What was here before is gone. Understood in the historic context, we understand that this is a desirable change in state, and the values that have been displaced here still occur in this wetland system. Those are edge species. They're not meant to be growing in the deepest parts of the wetland. So like I say, interpretation is really important. Understanding that historical context, it puts things into perspective. The Walker Swamp site, this image shows you the overlay between the LiDAR data, drainage overlay, property boundary. There's a couple of wetlands next door that we've restored in the national park as well. But there were over 20 kilometres of drains and levees across this property. Before we backfilled them, the permanent works were informed by us doing a hydrological investigation just to work out how we could restore and maintain flows to meet that earlier level that I was telling you about, where the red gums are growing on the eastern side, and bearing in mind that we wanted to protect our neighbours from being inundated. They were very happy for us to remove the blue gums and restore the wetland, but they didn't want us sending the flows around the top of the wetland and into their floodplain area. So we reinforced a couple of existing levee banks and utilised the existing drainage line at the edge of the property before sending water into the national park. So a really neat solution that allowed us to get our target level for inundation in the eastern part of the property. That property came with lots of legacy issues, and I'm only showing you this really to illustrate how even in places where wetlands have been highly modified and land use has been changed, if you understand the site, whether the water is available, remedial works can help reverse most of these issues if the water's available. If it's not, you've got a problem. But where the water's available still, you can do, as we've done here, even remove the blue gums from the landscape, remediate the ground where the mounds and furrows had been planted literally through all the wetland beds. We haven't done that everywhere yet because there's still some stumps through some of it. And sorry, that's just changed itself. And also taking a look there at where the drain and original restoration trial structure was, we've now completely backfilled that, and you can see the disappearance of the blue gums. That's a before and after image below, believe it or not. You can see that bit of tree sticking in from the right. I know it's a bit hard to believe, but that is the same image, and it's now all capable of going underwater, that area. We moved our spillway and used that existing drainage outlet for controlling flows. And this is what those works look like. Combination of our normal trial methods, which we used here for the permanent solution. And that shows you the completion of the backfilling of drains upstream, and then the first filling event, the first time the wetland started to fill in 2019, partial filling event, didn't overflow, but gave us a bit of a taste and things were working as we hoped. And then in 2020, we had a full filling event for the first time, which was amazing to see, and what we call a set and forget solution, because this spillway flows go over at the height, and we adjusted it a little bit that first year, and this will be covered with earth. But basically, there's no gates, there's no weirs, there's no expensive infrastructure, no concrete. This is what the engineers like to do, and apologies for any engineers in the room, but this is what the training teaches you to do. When you come at this from a situation of thinking, right, well, how can we minimise our costs and maximise the ability for this site just to settle into its new regime, removing the need for that ongoing management can be really helpful. And in terms of wrapping up that story, you can see here that, before, after modification, the trial phase, the first year that we got a little bit of a filling, and then the final image on the right shows you just how the wetland looked when it filled for the first time in several decades. And I'm pleased to say, if you look closely at those red gums, they're in the right place, just on the edge of the full water supply level, which meant that the planning that we did, it all sort of came to fruition and everything fit together, which was fantastic. Aerial photography is obviously another great way of monitoring the response. Water observations from space are really helpful as well. So this is Landsat data that allows us to detect change over time, and you can see in its drain state there during the trial phase, and then now with full restoration. So this is also being detected from space, these changes that we're making. And that's just an overview of the site, pretty specky place. And you can see in the background, we've got further along with blue gum remediation. In the foreground, in the image at the top, you can see there the evidence of the former land use. So we've still got some legacy issues to deal with out there, but this sort of change is possible. So jumping across the ocean there and lobbing on the east coast of Tassie, the couple of sites there that we're going to talk to you about today are the side-by-side Ramsar sites, Moulting Lagoon and Apsley Marshes, and I guess adjacent shoreline areas of Moulting Lagoon. So the first of these that we'll look at in some detail is Long Point and Yards Hole, which were both formerly on the property called the Grange, but Long Point is now a Tasmanian Land Conservancy reserve, and also the Apsley Marshes, which is an entirely privately owned wetland area where the Apsley River enters the site. So I guess just to show you how some of the things we've talked about, fit together for and fit into the story for these sites in Tassie. So things we've gone back and looked at, there's old accounts and books and newspaper articles that we've been piecing together. There's old maps like that 1800s map of the Grange property when it was first established, which shows the salt marsh areas out at Long Point. You can see them sort of marked in light blue. There's a gap in the record at this site, which we have to do our best to piece together based on other information sources. And it's tricky because this part of Tasmania was colonised very early. And so the amount of records and material and the history of change because of access to convict labour means that some sites were modified quite early. So we see that in the first aerial photography out there, that there was already what looked like a drainage impact at the site. And you can see this marked here. Now what we've since worked out was a series of levee banks were built by hand by convicts sometime in the probably early mid 1800s. And you can see that the evidence of this is still very much apparent in the landscape today. That's the image at the top there. You can see looking along the levee bank, the vegetation tells us that. Remember the importance of microtopography in salt marsh areas. We've got different vegetation growing on the bank to that's growing next to it, and a void, or what looks like a channel, but is actually just a void next to it from where that material was gained. Tough job out there, but the convicts, they made some changes out in this part of the world very early on. And if you look at it from a land management point of view, if you've got free labour, I guess you try and do whatever you can to increase the productive capacity of your land, or at least very cheap labour. That's what that system of, or part of the Eastern Levee Bank looks like today. And in terms of what they were trying to achieve, we have worked out that these systems of levees looks like they were originally designed to isolate an area of about 80 hectares or 200 acres at Long Point to alter its hydrological regime, presumably to favour grazing conditions, bearing in mind that the draining or banking off, the drying out of environments along the coast in the early days was actually pretty common, people trying to improve its productive capacity for grazing. So thinking that if we can remove more of the wetland element and more of the inundation element, that will end up with more of the dry land species moving in. And remembering that the land was being used what we'll call pastorally at this time, which means they were just grazing whatever native vegetation grew there. So they were trying to deliberately cause a shift in vegetation communities towards terrestrial communities, not necessarily sowing plants at this point in time. The other works you can see there are some of the more recent works to the south that were done as part of a failed aquaculture enterprise. So when you fast forward and we piece together all of the information we can at this site from the aerial photographic record, you can see that there are a series of changes at different times. And this information's that really important for helping piece together that history of change. The works on what is still called the Grange at Yards Hole, and also the works down near Barkstand at Long Point. There was a series of channels and works done with the intention of trying to grow whitebait for the some of the commercial aquaculture enterprises, and also have areas where plankton could be harvested to grow that whitebait. But this, despite the amount of works that were done there, this was never operational and wasn't successful, which is amazing considering the amount of work they did out there. So those areas we won't talk a huge amount about, but I will show you some of the remedial works that have been started at Yards Hole. But the reason for really pointing this out is the era will determine the methods that we use. So the yellow lines were done by hand with convicts, and even though they're very extensive, they're less substantial works. These works that were done in the 90s that you can see there, very substantial, done with large machinery, excavators and the like. So a little bit more work involved in remediating those areas. Some of the other impacts that are very clearly need to be on our mind for this area. Projected sea level rise is a really big deal in this area, and you can see, depending on how we track for sea level rise, that substantial areas in this area are likely to experience changes in inundation, which will cause shifts in vegetation. You can see the projections there. And something certainly that all the landowners have been telling us about that have been there generationally is that the weather patterns on the east coast are changing, and you can actually see this in the data, which is a fascinating insight. This year-on-year rainfall and what that means for catchment flows and the reliability of rainfall, and when it falls in the season, it's changed. Overall, the rainfall patterns are causing this general decline in what we call the residual mass, or the kind of year-on-year effect of rainfall, which means that at a big picture scale, the landscape's actually drying out, which might seem counterintuitive in a year like we're having, but there's noise in there. So what you'll see is those big spikes in latter years. So even though the general trend is a drying one, we are getting these big episodic events, which means that in any given year it could actually be wetter. This does have an effect on a range of factors, particularly in river systems, because it can affect their ability to sustain permanent pools and base flows. Even if you're getting big flashy flows, if you're not getting enough rainfall in between. Now, obviously, these river systems are quite episodic on the east coast, but you can certainly picture the importance of this to the story of a wetland system downstream that is shaped by and responding to the regularity or the pulses of flows that are coming down the rivers. these two are important to consider because there's something we can't, at the site specific scale, we can't do a lot about these. We just have to be aware of these things that are going on. When we do have a closer look at what's going on site, then we are seeing some really interesting things going on in the photographic record. So you'll see here the earliest imagery to the latest, not only some drainage impacts there in the, well, there's in the middle image, you've got the levee bank that was there already. In the bottom image, you've got that aquaculture work, which wasn't and now is. But if you look closer, you'll see the amount of additional open ground or the amount of additional areas that are inundating. So certainly the effect of hydrological change from sea level rise is already being seen from the air over these areas over the last several decades. And if you go out and have a look on the ground, this is also playing out, and you can see it happening as we speak. So that image, you can see areas of Garnia phylum on the slightly higher ground still going okay, and the Garnia on the slightly lower ground is starting to be pushed out of that space. This is that shift of vegetation that can happen. This is certainly also supported by anecdotal observations that some of the people who either live around or own land around the site or visit the site, you know, hunters who use the site, have noticed changes in the shoreline around Moulting Lagoon. So this is a very real trend. And when we asked the Tasmanian Land Conservancy about this, and then went back and had a look at their photo points, which is fantastic that they've been collecting this sort of data out at Long Point. It's quite recent in some places. You'll see that the Garnia dieback there is quite evident just in the last decade alone. So yeah, these trends are going on in the background. In terms of how you piece that together with what we're looking at with hydrology, well, it is important to be collecting data before and after any further change that we make. We're really lucky that Tasmanian Land Conservancy already has a program of data collection out there. That's Bec with, I think, John Alders, who kindly helped us out with a revisit, and we've tried to add to and add value to the existing methods where they are able to interact with the works that we are doing out there or that have planned for remedial works. And this is a really important baseline because, as you can appreciate, with change happening anyway, and with us potentially about to initiate another change, it's useful to be able to tease those effects apart potentially, if we can. If we can't, all we're looking to also pick up is what is the trajectory of change that has been caused as a result of the even just remediating the physical footprint of the works themselves as well. So as well as the veg stuff, there's a program of water level and EC loggers that we've got out there telling us a little bit about how these different wetland features currently function, and will allow us to detect any changes in their function as a result of remedial works. And we're certainly expecting change in a couple of them, given that they were deliberately opened up through channelization with those works in the 90s. Did you want to add anything there, Bec, or are you?
Yeah, just to add, I guess we've also got the loggers in some of those tidal areas. So it's also telling us a bit about the relationship between each of those main holes, round hole, opening hole, yards hole, and the tidal environment.
That's exactly right, yeah. And in terms of the hydrological effect of the levee, the old 1800s levee bank out at Long Point, despite the fact that it's breached in a few places, and despite the fact that it doesn't look that substantial, even with the short amount of time we've had loggers out there, we can already see that when there are events happening, that we are either impounding water or preventing water from equalising either side of that bank. So after, you know, heavy rainfall events, it can sort of impound some water on the inside. After you know, tidal events, we can also potentially exclude water on the outside. So there is definitely a hydrological impact from the levee bank, as we would have predicted based on when I was discussing earlier about the importance of microtopography, particularly in really flat, low energy wetland systems like salt marsh, where any impediment to flow is going to cause reduce the ability for water levels to equalise either side of that impediment. And we're certainly seeing that at this site. So Yeah, in terms of what we've been doing out there, and this goal of really returning the landform to its natural state, and by there was discussion about whether this was necessary. Could we just open up the levee banks in a few more places? Is there a way of just doing some of this without having to do all of it? The conclusion we really came to is that because of the flatness of this landscape and because of the footprint of the works, it really did make sense to return the landform to its natural state. That means we'll have an increase in physical space there. We're removing the hydrological barriers, which will have that additional flow-on effect for wider areas than just the zone of the works. And that this also means that with that anticipated change in sea level, with other shifts that are going on, we'll have more of a seamless transition out there between and movement of vegetation types over time, which is preferable from an ecological point of view, to not have those barriers to the movement of those ecotones. We're patient when you make changes like this. Our attitude is that if it's, in this case, the Tasmanian Land Conservancy site, it's perpetually protected. We have all the time in the world to allow this area to adjust to the new hydrological regime, even though there's a short phase of disturbance at the beginning. This is the long game that we're playing here with hydrology. So yeah, and that really is the point, that this is about that long-term trajectory of recovery that we're trying to initiate and then lock in. So the works that have been done this year in March, firstly at Yards Hole, you'll see the legacy effect of those of the trench that was dug around the edge of Yards Hole for the failed aquaculture enterprise, and we've literally just gone around and picked up the spoil bank, been able to detect where the natural surface level was, and I didn't put a photo in of it, but it is very interesting. If you wanted to look up Yards Hole on our website, you'll see there's a story there that explains how we were able to work with the contractors to get their eye in to detect the material that was still buried there but dead, that shows where the old natural surface was, compressed garniers and a very clear change in soil type and colour, which meant that we were able to do this work quite accurately, despite the fact that we were doing it with big machines. So now we allow this site to sort of settle in and adjust back into its, allow those ecotones to reform down the slope, the wetland edge, and allow it to settle into its restored hydrological regime. There's one little zone there you'll notice that we haven't backfilled yet. That's because there's a rare salt marsh species that we are going to do a closer investigation of. That, interestingly, it looks like its seed probably came up in the sediment when that section was dug, and there's a patch of it growing on the spoil bank on one side. So there's a little bit more work we're going to do over the next 12 months to work out whether we what our best options are for that zone, and whether we do some translocations or whether there's enough of that plant already growing in the site. But we didn't want to rush that ahead of having the conversation with all the relevant people. So that's why that little section you can see at the top that hasn't been filled is there. And at the extension of that zone, you've got the outlet from Yards Hole, and you can see a series of ponds and channels and modifications that were made here, again, as a result of the aquaculture enterprise. And we've done our best to patch all that back up and make it look like it was previously. And, there is quite a zone there of disturbance in the short term, but in the longer term, this is a zone where, with regular tidal flows, inundation, and the type of characteristics of that ground, we're expecting to see this recover really well. The template was the very earliest image in 1948 that we had to work with, and you can see how we've managed to pretty much put this landscape back like it was, which was the objective. Right on view of the extension of the outlet channel, just to show you what the works look like on the ground while the machine was working. You can see the small excavator there, and this is what it looked like by the end of the job. Short-term disturbance footprint, but now that process of recovery and colonisation of salt marsh plants can begin. And so we did manage to make a start out at Long Point, even though it was only a short section of the old levee system because of the conditions. We've had a pretty wet year, obviously, and wanted to make sure that we didn't make a mess accessing the site. But we were able to get to this one part of the site, and the rest of these works will be completed next year. The logic of what we were doing out there was simply to sweep that levee bank back into the void, allow for the recreation of that gentle profile in the salt marsh between the lagoon and the inland salt marsh, which means that we now have that entire surface area available to carry flows and to equalise across the area. And then the recovery will be driven by both potentially seed bank that's being re-exposed in the undisturbed topsoil or from the adjacent vegetation. So we expect, you know, just as you can see that vegetation shifts go on after the bank was dug, and you can see a gorse plant there in the foreground. So often these levee banks or drain spoil banks end up becoming a spot where species that like dry conditions will get in. Great spot to find weeds. So I think it's good that we're removing that as a potential place for weed harbour at this location. And that just shows you the net effect at the end, which is I think pretty neat considering the scale of the works. Have been able to keep the footprint really narrow. For those of you, depending on site conditions and when and if the field trip happens, this is the type of thing you'll be able to wander around and have a look at on site. This is just looking back the other direction, just showing you again the works in progress, and you can see those gorse plants there. And the thing to look for here is the sudden shifts in vegetation either side of that bank, just showing you how it really has been modifying the hydrology of the salt marsh either side. And the convict dug banks and void next to it, you can see actually that's Kath there standing from the TLC standing in the drain, just to show you these aren't particularly huge, but doesn't take a big change in height and to affect that the way that water interacts because of that effect of microtopography. Right, so from above, this is what the change looks like, and here we don't have the benefit of an image before because of course the works were done in the 1800s, so that levee bank was already there, and in the 70s you can see it's still there. Before we started, we've obviously got we've got superimposed on top of that the outlet for those aquaculture works, which we haven't yet been able to deal with because we need the site to be drier and have a bigger machine to deal with that. But that's what we have done, which is this southern section of the eastern levee bank, just knitted that profile back together, and it's going to be really fascinating to watch how this area responds over time. Rightio, so jumping across to Apsley Marshes, and you know, considering that you can go for a long period of time between floods, I feel like, I don't know if we've been lucky or unlucky, that feels like every time we go out there's another downpour of rain and the place is flooding again. But it's made it a bit difficult to get around, but it's certainly been very interesting to see the site and just how wet it can get, considering that when it dries out, you can drive across these areas. You know, it's really fascinating to see the extremes that this particular site can go through, given the flashy flows that can come down the Apsley River. And, you know, this is a site where, again, the same era as the levee banks, you know, mid-early 1800s, it appears that convict labour was used to construct a series of drains across it. The chatter in the old references is that William Lyne, the original sort of patriarch of the Lyne family that came out in the early 1800s, had the idea of the drainage of the peat fens in the UK in his mind and was thinking of turning this into dairy country. That was the apparent objective. But and they went to great lengths with these systems of parallel drains and banks and all sorts that we've tried to work out what the original intention was, given that it hasn't ever really played out or been used in the purpose that it was intended for. That's where the network of drains are, and really the same drains that were there in the 1800s are the same ones that are there today, and they haven't been modified in the photographic record to any great extent. So it's quite interesting that these are quite early works, and the effect that they've had and continuing to have is really as a result of a process that began a very long time ago. But they're substantial, as you can see there. You know, these are not, even though they were dug by hand, they're pretty significant. I can't imagine the conditions those guys worked in out there. Would have been incredibly difficult. So in terms of trying to piece together how the different components fit together, you know, this is the best estimate we've come up with so far for the design. So that's the Apsley River, where it terminates into the Apsley Marshes, which is an area of fresh marsh where the river discharges and then seeps into the more saline and tidal Moulting Lagoon downstream. And so what we've been able to piece together is what it looks like. There are a series of drains and levees designed to contain the flows to one side of the marshes and to attenuate those flows, with the levee systems and the dual drains designed to really maximise the ability to dry out an area of central marsh. The same thing from the other side. So this is where the Apsley Creek comes in, and again, a diversion drain effectively around the outside, and what looks like then a levee bank and a deeper drain to dewater the central peatland. And if you look at that from above, that's what it appears the objective probably was. And I say was because while it's still doing this to some extent, the central peatland has never really turned out to be some, the land of milk and honey, of whatever they may have envisaged from this design. It's only ever been grazing country and only ever been seasonally utilised, depending on the prevailing conditions, by the current owners who've been generational farmers out there, the Cusicks. But why has it never been able to be used for what it was intended for? Well, it's probably a big driver of this is this process of peat subsidence. And we see this in peat systems around the place quite commonly, where now this is an example from a peat dome, but the process is the same. If you drain an area of peatland, take the water out of it, then these processes kick in of subsidence, compression, oxidation, effectively decomposition of the peat. The peat sinks and then it gets wetter again because it recontacts the water table. You can see this in this image here. Depending on how close you are to the drain or canal, in this case they've labelled it as, will determine the depth of that collapse process. But it does mean that we get a little bit tripped up in peatlands, because you can go out to an area like the Apsley Marshes and go, well, there's great vegetation here and fantastic looking communities. And some of it is very much either novel or has responded in more recent decades as a result of that peat collapse process and the water table recontacting the upper profile of the peat. Certainly the Cusicks have been noticing that the production potential for grazing has been diminishing over time at this site. And unlike other peatlands in some places with more elevation difference, this site is very close to sea level. So there's only so far you can sink before you end up contacting more salty water, which is an issue that they've been encountering. The depth to drainage and subsidence over time, you can see, it's very quick initially when you drain an area. There's lots of collapse and subsidence, and that subsidence rate decreases over time. This is an example from New Zealand, actually, which is probably quite relevant for the sort of landscape context we're talking about. So yeah, at the Apsley Marshes, it's complicated. This is a big site. It's a complicated site. There's a lot going on. There's interplay between drains, vegetation, either remnant, residual, recovering, whatever you want to call it, the peat subsiding, and now with that peat subsidence, we've got ingress of tidal flows pushing back up those drains in high tide events and actually pushing saline water into areas that were previously fresh marsh. So, we've come up with a timeline that's in one of the project updates that I won't go through the detail of here, but we've got a reasonable idea now, having pieced all this together, of the likely chain of events that's led us to the situation we're in today. And importantly, we've been able to thread the landowner observations in and see how they fit into that story, because that is really important. You can't come up with a timeline that doesn't make sense to the people who've lived on this place their whole lives. And obviously, when you consider that relationship exists, it's not surprising that we see this playing out in the vegetation. So there are absolute relationships there between the location of drains and levee banks. You'll see the sort of khaki greens in the centre there that align very neatly with the boundaries between areas that have, drains and levee banks are very much driving what's going on with the ecology in those areas, despite the fact that drainage wasn't entirely effective. And the bluer and greener areas to the bottom, now they are migrating inland, and clearly there are preferential pathways for tidal flows that are now pushing back in, utilising the artificial drains to push back into this wetland system. So some really interesting things you can see when you combine all these sources of information together. This one we're still working out the okay and what will we do next, because we're still at very much the information gathering stage. Part of that information gathering was getting out there and putting some hydrological monitoring infrastructure in, and maybe Bec, we'll hear from another voice again. Would you like to jump in, just explain why these sites are where they are, and yeah, any observations you've got about the hydro monitoring at Apsley Marshes?
Yeah, sure. We've only just managed to get these in the week before Easter. Actually, it's been so wet out there this season. And we were really keen to get them in before winter. So there was lots of kayaking, there was lots of wading out across the site to get these in, but we managed to get them all installed. So you'll see we've got a couple of transects of loggers there. So these are logging water levels and salinity. So we've sort of got a northwest, southeast one down one of those, that main western drain, just to see, I guess, understand more the relationship of the northern area where the Apsley River comes in and the tidal areas, and how far those tides are pushing up. Anecdotal evidence from landholders suggests that they're pushing up into that deeper western wetland, sort of in the middle marshes. So just to see how far those spring tides are getting up those channels, and also across from sort of west to east in the middle there as well. That middle area, as you saw from the vegetation map Mark showed on the previous slide, is where it seems to be more transitionary, and yeah, there's very obvious differences in vegetation in that western cell, the central cell, and the eastern cell. So trying to understand what the water regime is in there and what impact those drains might have had over time. And just to give you an idea, those drains in the northern end are like maybe 30, 40 centimetres, half a metre at most. The drains right down the southern end, and Justine Latin, colleagues online as well, we're out in a kayak there, and they're 2 to 3 metres or more deep as you head out to Moulting Lagoon. So I'm not surprised at all that, given where groundwater levels are in the lagoon and high tides are pushing right up those drains, they're incredibly deep.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Bec. That's a really great overview of hydro monitoring out there. So just about on time. Just to wrap up, the next steps for these two sites, and oops, where are we? Just get that to come up. There we go. So there was a field day planned next week. I say was because I think with conditions the way they are, there's a chance that this may get delayed. So for those of you that have registered, bear that in mind, that you'll be hearing from Kath at some stage soon, just to let you know where that's up to and whether it needs to be delayed. But yeah, because of the site and the nature of it, you need to be physically able to hike across salt marsh terrain. If you're interested and haven't registered, it's not too late to let Kath know. So her email address is there. Obviously, we're going to continue with this ongoing data collection, and this will help define the baseline at both sites, measure the response of any remedial works, and also future change, sea level rise, climatic impacts on inflows and the like. So yeah, this project we hope will end up leaving a positive legacy that informs management of these areas beyond our couple of years stint working on this particular aspect. We do have works planned to continue with the remedial action out there at Long Point. So the remainder of that levee system and also the aquaculture works are still due to be remediated. That'll be in hopefully February, March next year. And am I allowed to say, hopefully we have not quite such a wet summer next year? I know it's great and everything, but we, for site access, it's been a bit of a challenge. So fingers crossed on that. Obviously the Apsley Marshes site, we're still very much in the throes of piecing this together and sharing with you what we're learning as we go, and the options for how we might deal with this site, given I will say it's more complicated than what we've been doing in the earlier example. So we're going to be nutting that out, and the options we'll be pulling together next year, bearing in mind that the works, if there are works proposed for there, they're not funded through the current project. It would be a basis for something that might follow. And then we'll have a field day, obviously, out there as well next year, which will be a chance to share when we've got a little bit further along with that. So the other thing we're hoping to do is just review more of the periphery of Moulting Lagoon. There are other places that have got drains that are causing eco-hydrological impacts. We're focused on a couple of the target areas that NRM South have got existing partnerships and relationships with, which are the ones we've spoken about today. But we're very conscious of making sure that we check out the other possibilities, bearing in mind that the Ramsar site's not going anywhere, and that these issues, if there are other issues that can be addressed down the track, we're certainly looking to try and do that. Rightio, so on that note, somehow miraculously we're right on time. which I have no idea how we've done that. But in terms of jumping across to the workshop bit, because you're probably all sick of hearing me talk, now we're going to give you guys a chance to chat and to share your observations and ideas. But before we break out, and before I just cancel this screen so I can see Beck again, what the agenda is for the breakout group is as follows. We're going to give everyone a chance to introduce who you are, where you're from, what your interest is in wetland restoration. I think it'd be a good way to start, just so everyone knows who they're talking with. Hopefully conducive to having a great conversation. And then these few questions, have you got any feedback or ideas for the work we're doing, bearing in mind that we're always open to taking on more information. This is not a linear process. So any observations you've got or ideas you can share with us would be most welcome. Knowledge, information, historic material, anything is most welcome. And finally, are there any other... Oh, and I guess the other thing was just to mention, if you've got questions, feel free, they'll get noted down. And if we don't get to them today, then we can certainly follow up with you as well. Final thing is that the thought being that given that we've got people here from around Tassie and a few from elsewhere as well, if there are other places that after seeing this material today, you sort of think, gee, we'd really like to get this issue or this place looked at some point down the track. We'd love to hear from you as well. And just to, we'll take people's details for that, and we can have a follow-up conversation with you later, rather than, we won't necessarily go into the detail of those today, but we are keen to capture those ideas where people have them. That's where we'll leave the workshop today, as the session went into breakout groups. But if you would like to follow up with Nature Colonial Trust and have any inquiries about wetland restoration, you can follow up by contacting us at the contact details on the screen now.